with the womanliness of the Cuban woman. But for Neel, the real revelation was the community of artists of which she and Carlos quickly became a part. This was a heady time, not just for Neel, but for Cuban culture itself. We completely lived the vie bohemienne, she said. It was more civilized there. The writers and poets and artists all got together. On December 26, 1926, Neel gave birth to a daughter. Her description of childbirth is unsparing. So I had this baby. They're more animal than we are in Havana, and for them to have a child is the most normal thing in the world. For me, it was a major event. They don't give anesthesia there, and for me to have a baby without anesthesia was frightful. In the end, it had been 8 hours of agony. About 5 months later, she and Carlos were a sensation at the Art Nouveau show, where the Vanguardia movement, of which Carlos was an important part, made its debut. Neel showed some of her portraits of local people, including one of a mother and child. But if the show marked her arrival as a successful professional artist, it also marked her abrupt departure from Havana. Neel left for America with Santiana, where eventually Carlos joined her. They moved to a one-room apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side, where their lives as starving artists began in earnest. Nothing could have prepared Alice and Carlos for the tragedy that occurred that winter, when Santiana, who up until then had been a very beautiful, healthy child, got diphtheria, then prevalent, although, as Neel bitterly recalled, only a year later the vaccine became available. Alice must have been terrified when Santiana became ill, with symptoms that could have included nausea, chills, high fever, and neck swelling. Neel tried everything in her power to take care of her sick daughter. She tried to break Santiana's fever by burning a spiritus lamp. Neel took the baby, then 10 months old, home to Colwyn, enlisting the aid of her mother. But Santiana died just short of her first birthday. The same minister who married her and Carlos performed the funeral rites for their first child. Neel clearly remained full of guilt and remorse. In the autobiographical piece she wrote at the time called Money, Neel hauntingly laments the circumstances that may have led to Santiana's death. Do you know how much an oil stove costs? About $5. But if you see if I'd had the money, the green lovely dollars, the shining quarters to buy a coat with, maybe I wouldn't have caught laryngitis so badly. If we hadn't had to live in one little room, the baby maybe wouldn't have caught it like she did. And then if I could have paid a doctor, I wouldn't have been so slow to call one. And then it was so cold, oh so cold. If only I'd had an oil stove to keep the room warm at night. Oh my God, a black oil stove haunts me. Well, she died, mostly from the goddamn discomfort. How do you expect one to feel about money? After that, his family sent him some, but I didn't like to eat because I knew the baby dying had earned those meals for us. Santiana was buried in the family plot in Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania. There are no tombstones marking any of the Neel family graves, perhaps because they couldn't afford them. In the beginning, I didn't want children. I just got them. But then when she died, it was frightful, Neel said. The coming year would produce several memorable watercolors as Neel attempted to process her intense grief. But the painting that most powerfully expresses her despair is the clay-colored Futility of Effort, based on an early sketch Neel made when Santiana died. Painted a full 2 years later, the picture expresses the primal feeling of failure that overwhelms any parent whose child, defying the natural order of things, dies first, rendering for naught all the care and nurturing it has been given. Neel here conflates her subconscious guilt with a newspaper account of a child strangling to death between two bedposts. In Neel's rendition, it looks like the child has died in its own crib. There's the vaguest outline of an adult, heedless, outside the door, and the window is a black hole in space, as much a reminder of the vaginal opening through which a child enters the world as the void following death. As Neel later said, even Picasso only used gray and white when he did the Guernica. Color is just too cheerful and happy for this sort of situation. I had had that child in Havana, and she died in New York just before she was a year old of diphtheria. There's a picture I made 3 years later that's a distillation of that and so much else, the futility of effort. Into it went the amount of effort you put into having a child, pregnancy, all the rest, then the tragedy of losing it, everything, everything. As she wrote in a poem around that time, oh, I was full of theories, of grand experiments, to live a normal woman's life, to have children, to be the painting and the painter. I've lost my child, my love, my life, and all the goddamn business that makes life worth living. Now I'm going to fast forward because Neel actually her whole story is almost like Rocky in that she had this fantastic second chapter, and her story is really a triumphant one of surviving against adversity. and read you a bit from much later in the book, in Neel's 80s. Neel went on to live a full and productive life despite a number of other tragedies and crises and a fairly constant level of drama. Part of what drew me to her story was her sheer willpower and how her painting served as a survival tactic. After Carlos abandoned her, taking Isabella, their second child, back to Havana, Neel suffered a complete nervous breakdown and spent a year in a private sanitarium. She emerged to live in the village in the early 1930s during the Depression and got on the easel project of the WPA, only to have her lover at the time destroy most of her work. After Carlos, Neel never married again, but she had several more long-term partners and 2 more children, her sons, Richard and Hartley. Neel finally emerged as a feminist icon in the 1970s, achieving the recognition that had eluded her most of her life. She had a retrospective at the Whitney Museum in 1974, and she did some of her strongest and most provocative work in her final decade or so. Her famous portrait of Andy Warhol, stripped to the waist to reveal his scars and surgical corset, was painted in 1970, and her painting of Annie Sprinkle in full fetish gear and with pierced labia was done in 1982. She continued to paint prolifically right up to the time of her death in 1984. In fact, her final portrait is that of her attending physician. I'm just going to read you a tiny bit from the book itself, because I think it really sums up Neel's absolutely remarkable creative power. One of the last paintings Neel made was one of her rare self-portraits. At 80, Neel cast his relentless eye on herself as on the hundreds of subjects of her long career. Perched on a chair, the artist known for her scathing nude portraits is stripped down to her quintessence. Naked but for her glasses, a paintbrush, and a rag, she bravely renders herself with neither clothing nor props, her aging body equipped just with the tools of her craft, her vision, and her deftly wielded implements, as if to make the definitive statement of self-expression. I paint, therefore I am. The flesh may sag, may, as Neel put it, be dropping off the bone, but the artist and her ability to paint remain forcefully intact. It's a radical departure from the standard artist's self-portrait, and in its stark veracity beautifully illustrates Neel's original and enduring American vision. The road that I pursued, and the road that I think keeps you an artist, is that no matter what happens to you, you still keep on painting, she once said. Thank you. If anybody has any questions whatsoever, I'd be happy to answer them. Yeah?
I was just wondering, what was the genesis of your interest in Alice Neel?
I had written a biography of Jean-Michel Basquiat, which was frustrating in that he died at the age of 27 and led a fairly tragic life. And the book was much more an expose of the 80s art world than a biography of a painter. And I was kind of searching around for another subject, and I began working at Us Weekly. And up until then, I had done a lot of investigative stories about culture. And at Us Weekly, which, as most of you know, is a celebrity magazine, I was doing, profiles of Whitney Houston without ever interviewing her. So I felt, you might say, profundity challenged, and I was looking for a new subject. And I went to the Whitney, where there had been a retrospective of Neel up for something like 3 months, and I hadn't bothered to go. And for years and years and years, friends of mine who were painters had idolized Alice Neel. And I actually didn't even know what her work looked like. And I went to the Whitney, and I was completely floored by the power of the paintings. And then I read a little tiny bit about her life, enough to know that it was interesting. And I called up the curator of the show at the Whitney, and I said, is there a biography? And she said no. And I wrote the proposal just after 9/11, actually. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, that apartment you mentioned, does somebody live in it?
Yeah, it may have turned out to be a problem for the family that I used that as the beginning of the book. It's actually the first page of the book. It's a rent-stabilized apartment that the family has kept, and that her oldest son, Richard, uses as an office. And so he's in there every single day, using it as an office. It is not open to the public. I mean, I suppose if you worked for a museum where you had a good reason to go there for research, you could get in the way I did, but it is not publicly available, although it is fascinating. It's probably a little cleaner than when she lived there, because she was a bit of a slob, but it looks like she just walked out of the room. Anybody else?
Have you ever seen the documentary on Alice Neel?
Yeah, it's in the epilogue of my book, and I did a piece about it. Andrew Neel did that. I think it came out in 2007, and it's a wonderful documentary. I loved it. But it's very different than the biography. He didn't know a lot about Alice because she died when he was only about 4 or 5, and it was kind of a discovery process for him, and he was very specific in not wanting to make it purely biographical, but more sort of memoirish, and it was. And I think it's a fascinating documentary. Anybody else? Yeah.
Curious, because the younger generation, a lot of people actually don't know Alice Neel. It's an elusive character for some, and then when she does come to her psyche now and again. So I'm wondering what kind of response you're getting now with this book coming out now. Generations.
Yeah, it's sort of astonishing. I mean, given that Alice Neel painted in obscurity for most of her life, and then really got into the spotlight on the coattails of feminism at the same time as declaring that she was not a feminist or not, a card-carrying feminist. An amazing response, actually much more than to Basquiat. I don't know whether that's because that was kind of a tale of tragedy and this is one of triumph, but people love Alice Neel. It could be because she paints people, and her life spanned the 20th century, and so you've got people ranging from people, like labor organizers of the 20s and Communist Party members all the way through Andy Warhol and Henry Geldzahler and so on. But people absolutely are fascinated by her. And it's a little bit of an Alice Neel moment because she had a second retrospective that started at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston that went to the Whitechapel Gallery in London, where it got rave reviews, and then on to Malmo, Sweden. But that and also Andrew Neil's documentary, I think, have brought her more into the public eye for a younger generation. And she's kind of a beloved New York character. I mean, she was, quite eccentric and a character, So, anybody else? Yeah.
You were saying that the whole question about her life spanning the century, and she was obviously very involved with the art world and had access to, all sorts of people she was painting. But was she also very engaged politically, or was that sort of a sector?
Totally. I mean, she was, she became a communist in the 30s. She remained a communist until the end of her life. She was the first living American artist to have a retrospective in the Soviet Union in the 80s, way past the point when even Alice Neel would have thought that that was a good way to run a government, and, pretty much said so. And her first stage of art was social realism, which was sort of like the heroic art of the 20s and 30s, which then became very, very marginalized. But social realism, if you look at it, a lot of it almost looks like Soviet propaganda posters. It's very realistic. It's often, it's very political. I mean, she did an incredible painting called Nazis Murdered Jews, which was of a torchlight parade in the 30s, and it was a very audacious thing to do. And she later said many times that if people had paid more attention to it, more Jews would have been saved. So, yes, she was very politically engaged. She also continued marching in protest right through her 70s, even when she could, not walk that well. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
How did she feel about being a woman painter throughout these different,
she always said that she didn't think of herself as a woman painter. She thought of herself as a painter, that when she was standing, when she was facing her easel with a brush in her hand, she was an artist. She was not a man or a woman. She took exception to the feminist line that women paint differently than men do. She didn't think so at all. She found that insulting. But she also knew that she had been, that it was a bias against her, not just because she was a realist, but because she was a portrait painter, and not just because she was a portrait painter when portraiture had been declared dead many times over, but because she was a woman. And, you don't have to be Jerry Saltz to point out that women are still, way underrepresented in museums and galleries to this very day, despite the Guerrilla Girls. It's gotten a lot better, but it's not equal still.
Like society likes them as individuals to iconize, everything then rather